Welcome to this lesson, and today I would like us to learn about loops, and we are going to learn about different kinds of loops. There are different kinds of loops. For instance, is a while loop, the for loop, and the do while loop, and we are going to study each one of them and its application area and how you get to use it in the Java programming language. Why do you use loops? Loops are used whenever you want to perform iterations, and iterations is basically whenever you want to repeat an operation several times in your program. For instance, let's assume you have a database of students and you would like to display their names. Ideally, the code that you write to display their names should be the same, and therefore, there wouldn't be a need to write the code to display the names for these students, for student 1, student 2, all the way to student number 100. It would be very tedious, and you can even, in fact, imagine whenever you would have, like, let's say, 1,000, 10,000 records, a million records, it would be very tedious. So that is the purpose of loops, to execute a repeated operation. These repeated operations are normally called iterations. So let me type that, iterations. And so every time the loop runs, we call that one iteration. So if your loop is supposed to run 100 times, we say that your loop has 100 iterations. So for each iteration is going to execute a set of statements. So let's start with the while loop. Before I read the while loop, we have the while loop, the do while loop, and the for loop. We also have the for loop and the for each loop. The for each loop, each of them, we will be studying them and how you can be able to apply them. So we are going to start with the while loop, and we are going to study its syntax and what to take care of so that you can be able to avoid errors in your program. So I'm going to define a variable, and this variable is basically going to act as a counter, where every time the loop runs, we are going to increment the counter so that we can be able to know whether we have attained the number of times or the number of iterations we would like to run for that particular loop. So it's going to be an integer variable, int, in counter. In counter, we are going to initialize it to 0. Is going to be initialized to 0, and then we are going to write our while loop. While is the keyword representing the while loop, followed by the round braces, and then of course the curly braces always appear. Very good. So we are going to learn this loop, let's say for how many times? Let's try with the first 10 times. So we are going to say, as long as the counter is less than 10, then execute a set of statements. So we're going to say, as long as the counter is less than, remember the comparison operators, is less than 10, then execute a set of statements. So in this case, we are going to make it very, very simple. We just want to know when is the iteration, which iteration this is. So we're going to say this is iteration number. We concatenate with the counter variable. So how does this work? Even before we run it, what happens is that when the program comes to the main method, is going to find that we have a variable called counter, and it is initialized to 0. It's going to come and counter the while keyword, and it's going to automatically know that we are running a loop, and it's going to check the condition in the while statement. And in the condition in the while statement is that as long as the counter is less than 10, then we should print out iteration, the number of iteration that the position of the iteration that is in. So in the first loop, or in the first iteration, counter is 0. It comes and compares. Is counter is 0 less than 10? Yes, 0 is less than 10. It executes that particular statement. So what do you do for you to move on to the next iteration? For instance, to advance the counter from 0 to 1, you use the increment operator, which we learned earlier. And to use the increment operator, we use counter plus plus. Plus plus is the increment operator. The opposite is the decrement operator, which is normally the opposite of the increment operator is a decrement operator, which is 2 minus signs. So whenever we do this, it's going to run the iteration, print out what iteration number it is, and then advance from 0 to 1. Again, it's going to come again to the while loop and compare, is 1 less than 10? Yes, it is less than 10. It's going to execute the set of statements again, and then it's going to increment from 1 to 2 all the way to 10. So when it is at 10, it's going to find out that is 10 less than 10? Obviously no. So the condition is going to return false, and therefore it's going to exit the loop. Very good. So let's run our program and find out whether it actually does that. Very good. Very good. So it tells us that we are on iteration 0, iteration 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to iteration 9. So you may ask yourself, why is iteration number 10 not printed? Obviously because our comparison operator is for less than, not less than or equal to, and 10, when we compare, is 10 less than 10? Obviously, we cannot compare it that way. Therefore, that condition is going to fail. One important thing that you must always remember whenever you are working with loops is that you must always avoid the scenario for infinite loops. And what are infinite loops? An infinite loop occurs when your program or when your loop runs infinitely or runs without stop, without stopping. And when does that normally happen? That normally happens whenever the condition in the while statement always executes to true. And how can that scenario arise? It normally arises whenever your counter is not incremented or is not advanced. For instance, if we don't advance this one, realize that I have commented this one so that it doesn't get executed. So what happens in that case? Our counter is always going to be 0. So for every iteration, we are always going to be comparing is 0 less than 10. And because we are not incrementing, our counter value does not change. It remains to be 0. So 0 will always be less than 10. And therefore, our loop is going to run forever. And why is this a risk? Of course, it's a risk because it poses processing issues, memory issues, assuming your program is consuming a lot of processing power and also a lot of memory. It means that it's going to put a strain on the machine resources or on the computer resources, and therefore it may even cause your computer to crash or even the program to behave abnormally. Let's try just so that we can be able to illustrate what we are saying here. I'm going to run this program, but keep in mind that because we are not incrementing the counter, we are going to experience an infinite loop. So whenever I run this program, I expect an infinite loop that never advances the counter, that whose while condition always while condition. So as you can see, we have iteration number 0 being printed. So and as you can notice my iteration number is actually getting bigger and bigger. As you can see, it is actually still printing them, and that's the infinite loop that you must avoid whenever you are loop. Let me for example getting bigger and bigger. So many iterations you can see, and that actually the counter is never advanced. That's the if it loops at position 1, and therefore the while statement or the while expression always evaluates, and that's because how about when we return it when we get back as it was when we return it when it is going back as it was normally, because we have avoided the scenario for the infinite loop. So key takeaways from this lesson: number 1, what are loop statements, what are iterations, what are the various loop statements, and how do you actually avoid an infinite loop, and actually what is an infinite loop. So see you in the next video. Keep learning, keep enjoying. Thank you.